William Russell, playwright, songwriter of the parish. You were there. What was the Mersey Sound?
What was the Mersey Sound? Oh, that's... it was unique because it was infused with an innate love by the practitioners of black music, be it rhythm and blues, be it the blues, mostly rhythm and blues. And it was determinedly and awkwardly of the place. It was a Mersey music. I mean, I wouldn't say a Liverpool music because it straddled both sides of the river, but it was a hybrid that was uniquely Merseyside, and it didn't look to London in any sense. There was a dogged kind of refusal to try to do what London was doing. I mean, there was no manifesto. I don't think anybody had any kind of political notion about what they were doing. I think Liverpoolians just do, what they like, what they feel, with no regard to trying to make it in the charts or all those kind of things. They weren't trying to chase the charts. I thought just occurred to me, I lost it. Maybe it'll come back a bit later. Other cities were doing similar things. It could have been Geordie Beat because there was a great scene happening at the same time in Newcastle. There was a great Manchester scene. But I think we've got to say it because I'm sure it's the thing that's run all the way through this, the elephant in the room. The one thing that great bands, though Manchester had, Sheffield had, Newcastle had, they didn't have the Beatles, and that's the one thing that made all the difference. I mean, I think kind of like if you'd not had the Beatles, who then took that whole thing and used the Mersey beat element as a starting point that went into some of the most astounding musical areas. If you'd not had that, then Mersey beat would just be the kind of cultural reference that is something like Northern Soul. A great kind of movement, but it didn't break out into the rest of the world. Whereas the DNA of Mersey beat was still in the Beatles when they finished.
Excellent. Can I take you back even further? Childhood. When did music first come into your life? Was there a particular sound, song? Was it a musical family?
Yeah, but my family was a music. All working class families, close-knit kind of working class areres, I think were musical in those days.
You have a piano?
No, we didn't have. We did have a piano. It was chopped up one winter. Firewood. Yeah, no, it was that bad actually. Obviously, it wasn't a great piano. But my father, he was a terrific mouth harp player, button key chromatic, not a blues harp. And you play all the sophisticated 30s, 40s tunes on that stuff. He was also a great spoons player, but he was a horrendous accordion player. And he had this 180 bass button key bloody thing. And he used to play it with no correlation between the left and the right hand. He could play the melody on the keys, but he seemed to think that all you need to do was hit a button on the left-hand side in some kind of tempo, and so you had this discordant man. He would go into a room, and there was kind of paper-thin walls in the bungalow we lived in at the time at Knowsley, and he'd go into this room thinking that the rest of us couldn't hear this wailing, It was horrendous. Anyway, that apart.
What sort of numbers was he playing?
Oh, he'd be playing everything from, Cole Porter, Hoagie Carmichael. Again, like most kind of Liverpoolians, working class people, looked far more to America than to London, because it's always run through English life, that class thing, hasn't it? And if you were into that kind of Ted Heath, Joe Loss kind of orchestra arrangements, they were associated with Mayfair, and Mayfair was broadcast on the radio, and it was broadcast in the kind of tones that I'm adopting now, which was class. It was about, we are the people who tell you people how you should behave and where your place is. And so there was, in my family certainly, there was a deep, deep loathing of that patrician, you know, we are the privileged, when it was applied to music. And so the view and the ear was turned to the Americas, where it was much more classless, you know. Nobody was trying to tell you what to do. And it moved more, you know, the American side of things. And so the stuff that was played tended to be more American, I would say. But also, in the area where I lived, I mean, every other house but two had a piano, and there was always somebody who could play a bit of piano. So even if we weren't in our house, music would be being made. It was just around in those days. I mean, this is pre-television, really. I mean, there was television, but this is pre-1953, where, you know, the cup final and the coronation encouraged the nation to go TV. And of course, even when TV started, it closed down at 7 o'clock in the evening. It was, you know, so you still had to make your own entertainment, and people did. And I remember in those days, there was a thing called street singers. You're probably too young to remember those. People would, you know, walk down the middle of a suburban street, usually with a semi-trained or even trained operatic voice, you know, and sing some of the great arias of the day. And it was a way of busking, you know, and you'd go out and give them money, and it was fantastic. I had some fantastic singers, you know, to my
drums these days, don't we?
There'd be drums, there'd be houseboat. and I remember I was in hospital for a while with a thing called nephritis, kidney thing. Nothing now, treated with antibiotics, but in those days I was doing. And I remember used to listen a lot to, because I was bored rigid, you know, in this hospital for what felt like months. And I used to listen to all the hits of the day, Oh My Papa, 20 Tiny Fingers, 20 Tiny, those kind of, Valdera. I mean, it was, you know.
What were you tuning into?
You never have a machine gun when you need one. I don't know, would it have been the light program? I mean, I wasn't tuning into it, it was on the, you know, the hospital system. And then I very early got into, I must have been 8, 9, and I got into Buddy Holly. I even had Chuck Berry early at that age, Little Richard.
Elvis, because Elvis had hit.
Well, my cousin Dorothy was a huge Elvis fan.
Lonnie
was a massive, Lonnie was. I remember probably the record that I first began to play was owned by a mate of mine there called Anthony Neal, and he had Put In On The Style. Oh God, I played that record to death. I just loved it so much, you know. It's a great lyric, but there was just something in the way it moved that got you down there. You know, where that was the great strength of you know, rock music, pop music, whatever, you know, that's where it got you. Before the lyrics ever got me, it would always be the sound of the record. And then I remember, well, underneath the rickety old lamppost that was outside our house in Knowsley, I remember being outside there one night in the dark, and, you know, young kids, you gather around, like moths, around a bit of light source. And we were out, and this kid, an older kid, started to sing Dream Lover. And it was the most enchanting, devastating. And I suddenly realised that these people that I'd been listening to on the radio, even seen on the telly by now, they were real people. Real people could make this sound, you know. It was just, you know, an incredible thing to hear Dream Lover sound like that. And that was another thing that kind of got me hooked.
Did this encourage you to pick up a guitar?
Not at all.
Instrument of any kind?
No, I think I was bought a guitar very early on because of the love of the music, and it was like it was a Spanish, probably nylon string guitar. And when I took a look at that and plucked it, I couldn't work out how you were ever on this thing gonna do da 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 da. You know, it was not going to happen. So we went into the corner, collected dust, and then cut ahead a few years, and I was out on my bike, and a lad who was older than us, we started talking to me and Tom Evans, in fact, later in Badfinger. And me and Tom, we were brought up on the same estate, we were great mates. He was a massive Everleigh fan, I was a massive Buddy Holly fan by then. And this older kid from our school, he'd started work, and me and Tommy had started going to things on our own, things like the Moss Empire shows. We'd been to see the Shadows, and even though we weren't great Shadows fans, seeing Fender Stratocasters, the light bouncing off them, it was kind of good stuff. And I think we were probably bragging a bit to this lad, and he said, yeah, that's all right. He said, but I go to cave. I went, the what? The cave? The cavern? What's... He said, because I work in Dale Street in an office, He said, and I go every lunchtime. Every lunch hour. We went, what is it? He said, oh, you get some fantastic... And the idea that 6 miles from where we lived, there would be a place in which people were playing without it being in a big theatre and organised and 10 people on the bill. I mean, the thought had just never occurred to two 14-year-old boys. Why would it, And not long after that, we both persuaded our parents that we were going out on a Sunday night. And we went, we found a cabin, had that first whiff of intoxicating, rotting fruit mixed with cheap perfume, mixed with the wonderful disinfectant smell that everybody talks about,
You remember going down those stairs?
Going downstairs. I'm really terrified that we wouldn't get in, because we're only 14.
Did you look 14?
No, I always looked older. And Tom was a bit shorter than me. But you see, it didn't sell alcohol.
No.
So it was fine, And we got down, and I think we had to join, 1 of 6, we had to sign the thing and that. And we were in. And we were watching people like, I don't know, Shane Fenton and, those kind of bands. And they did have Fenders, and we were so near to the stage. Yeah. And these wonderful smells and these fantastic looking girls. And I remember a guy called Perry used to be there. Real dude, used to do the festival. We'd never seen the Cavern Stomp, and completely new way of dancing. We were blown away. And we'd not gone down to see a particular band. Uh-huh. And we had to get back to Knowsley, and buses used to stop in those days. And so, we were going to leave at 9 o'clock to get back home for the curfew. We'd been told, make sure you're back here for bloody 10 o'clock and all that kind of stuff, And we were just about to go when we saw these aliens walk onto the stage, with their hair combed down like nobody had ever seen anybody in Britain with hair like that, and dressed in black. And then we saw these Vox AC30s come on. We'd never seen, and then a guitar that looked like a fiddle, was brought on, and then we thought we had to see the start of this, And it must have been by this time, it must have been 9:30 when the Beatles kicked into Some Other Guy. That was the world. One world ended and a new world began. It was just. It was the end of any attempt to carry on, struggling at school for me, and so it was really? Sagging and going down to the cabin every lunch hour, and the Beatles were on, and I just became, and Tom, a fortnight later, he had a guitar. I bought what I thought was a guitar. It was a cheese cutter. I mean, the strings were that far off the fretboard, you really could cut cheddar on it, and I didn't even know any different. And within weeks, I mean, Tommy was playing, really kind of quality. He was a gifted player, I had to wait for Bob Dylan to come along and show that you could do it with 3 chords if you were clever with words and that kind of stuff, and find that example. But that's when all that kind of stuff first took off for me was with Tom, who, as I say, later went on. He was using a band called I can't remember the first Liverpool band, which was in the Ivies. Yeah. Uh-huh. And then of course he joined with the Welsh Brigade, and they formed Badfinger. And I always thought I'd see Tom again. Always thought, crazy things. And I remember the day that the film of Educating Rita premiered, a day after, and I was in Bold Street. And the way you did in those days, because there was no internet, you bought the papers to see your reviews, And I opened this copy of the Times or the Guardian, and it reported the death of Tom Evans, I realised it would never happen,
You described the impact the Beatles had. Was that the impact you felt at that time, or is that sort of down the ears, rose-tinted specs?
You know,
was it that instant?
I have said this time and time again in interview after interview. You know, we knew at that moment, right, that we were part of history. Huh. The second that you heard Some of the Guy, you just knew this was going to happen. You know, that was it. You know, this was so extraordinary. This coming together, you know, this sound that was made, and I know Ringo wasn't even in yet. You know, we were there the day I was at the lunchtime when he first played, and George got smacked in the eye. You know, saw it happen. But you just knew that nothing could hold this in. You know, it was just a new way, as it turned out to be.
So this is going on underground.
Yep.
Up above, Liverpool.
Yep.
What are your memories of Liverpool? Growing up in Liverpool, I mean, how was the city? How is the city remembered by you from that period? Because it was certainly beaten and battered, wasn't it, after the war?
It
hadn't really been rebuilt.
The prime memory, I mean, don't forget for me, because we'd been moved out to this place called Knowsley on Lord Derby's land, and a little, you know, estate of prefabricated bungalows, Nissen huts. I mean, it looked like Stalag 17, you know, that's what it looked like, kind of blocks. I mean, real sub-housing. But we loved it, because it was about 300 of these bungalows with Liverpool speakers. So there's a Liverpool culture plonked down in the middle of the most stunning rural setting, you know. But it meant that if we went to town, we had to go to, you know, we had to get 2 buses, you had to get a bus to Page Moss, wait around, get frozen to death in the winter, then get another bus, get into town, you know. So there was a slight kind of, you know, we were going to a slightly frightening, slightly exotic, but my abiding memory is of the blackness. What people forget now is that all these magnificent Victorian buildings were pitted with soot, and they were only cleaned in I think it was the early 70s, the sandblasting started. So it was of the blackness of these kind of great mausoleum-looking places. It was the hustle and the bustle and the busyness of it. I remember there used to be rush hours in those days. Certain times when if you got on a bus, it would take 20 minutes just to get out of the centre of town. You know, it was a much busier place. The one place that I always remember it was lit up Lime Street. I don't know if you remember that area where there were a fantastic lit glass. Fluorescent tubes and advertising Schweppes and
right.
All that area now that's become St John's Market, right, from the cinema that would be going down towards Piccadilly Gardens. That was always lit up, and that was really rather kind of exotic area, you know.
Like Piccadilly Circus.
Yes, it was like Piccadilly, mini Piccadilly Circus, and of course. The other thing is town was very bright with that kind of architectural decoration anyway, because there were so many cinemas, because cinema was such a massive thing in those days.
What were you seeing?
What was I seeing?
Springs to mind? Did it matter?
I used to go when I was a little kid, and we used to go into town. We'd go to the news cartoon cinema.
Yeah,
it was on the loop. There was Tatler and the JC, I think it was, but I think they became porn places when they became the Tatler and the JC and all this dry stuff. I only seriously started going to the theatre when I was older, and I used to, I got to that kind of 15, 16 probably, and you know, you got the horn so much, you just go see anything if you thought it was X-rated, and you might see a flash of tit or whatever, you know. So we'd go to see things like Taste of Honey. Wow, that sounds really erotic. Now, of course, it wasn't remotely, but we were seeing great films. And it was the British New Wave, you know, Saturday Sunday, Billy Liar, kind of love it. God, I
Whistle Down the Wind.
Whistle, fantastic. And so they were the kind of films that I was seeing.
You mentioned the Beatles. There were a few other bands out there.
There were indeed.
When did it occur to you that there was an actual music scene across Merseyside? Did that suddenly hit?
I think
a lot of venues.
From the first time we went to the Cavern, we knew that there was a scene because there were so many bands on in one night at the Cavern, you know. And then we got to know about, you know, the Sink, the Downbeat, the Mardy, places like that. But I very rarely went to any of the clubs. I was a complete and Beatle, you know. Yeah. I mean, occasionally I'd turn up and the Beatles would have been scheduled for a lunchtime session, and I'd get there and there'd been a last minute cancellation or cock up or something, and the Big Three were on. Now, Big Three were really revered at the time, but for me, it just didn't cut it. I don't know what it is, but I've never been a fan of the Who. I've never been a fan of that trio kind of line, thing. Who would I remember the Hollies were always terrific at the Cavern. Strangely, because you didn't have much trouble with people who came from London. Joe Brown was always fantastic at the Cavern, you know. He used to play a piece by Grieg. It was in the Hall of the Mountain King. Right. For his intro, you know, and he was always great. Jerry, of course, was. I mean, I would always stay with Jerry because it was you know, the musicianship in that band was something, and he was, you know, very gifted. Is very gifted singer and player. But once it all took off, by '63, by the time the Cavern had become discovered, I was kind of out of there. I mean, it's that, you know, snobbery of youth. You know, it's no longer hip. Yeah. Right. If people, because I used to go into school. I mean, for my GCE, as it was in those days, my com was the only O level that I got in English. I wrote an essay called "A Group Called the Beatles," and you know, when I told other kids what I'd written, they pissed themselves laughing. The name Beatles wasn't known, and the idea that a group would be called the Beatles, it just sounded, you know, kind of daft to them, really.
Do you still have that piece?
No, I don't, because it went to the Examiner, and I always did wonder if, you know, the Examiner marked this 6 months later, thought, oh, I see. You know? But you know, when it got to the point where the people who used to deride me for talking about, and Tom Evans and people like that, you know, used to deride us for like this stuff. When they started appearing in the queue at the Cavern, you know, I thought, yeah, I'm off. You know, it had got, and there was no doubt about it. There was a certain decadence about it, you know, and people they were playing to the gallery. They were trying to get the record contract, and who can blame them? You know, completely understood that.
You were aware that London had descended on Liverpool.
You could not be, because you know, they were putting out stupid programs, and you know, the Cavern Stomp, and they were trying to make it into like hype the Big Three in order that they can be sold on the London kind of scene, you know, that horrible, sleazy, light entertainment kind of culture, you know, was corrupting something that had been so pure, you know, and so ballsy. You know, and people say, and it gets my goat when people rush to that daft comparison between the Stones and the Beatles. What's the point of comparing, you know? But they talk about the Beatles as being a pop band, you know, the Stones being a rock band. Good God, if you'd heard the Beatles in their Cavern set, and as I often say, a John and Paul song was a rarity in those days. It was hard ass. I mean, I wrote about it in John Paul, John Ringo and Bert, my play about the Beatles, and there's a speech that Bert makes about when he gets off the bus, you know, in North John Street. As soon as his foot hits the pavement, he knows if he's missed the opening of the Beatles set, because he can feel the bass cabinet there. And it was like that, you know. It was so heavy, such heavy music.
Other music was available.
It was, and I
quite a scene in Liverpool.
Well, it was. I really liked. There were a couple of bands that I really loved. One was Dennison's and the Mojos. Both terrific bands, you know. One of them, I can't remember which
Lewis
one.
Collins?
Was Lewis Collins in a Mojo? Oh, so I would have seen Lewis there in that. Yeah. Dennison's later on, not at the Cavern, I started to go with another friend of mine, Alan Davis, to the Locarno, and my memory of it is that the the Undertakers, were a kind of a permanent gig there on a Thursday night, you know, and I absolutely came to love them, you know, really loved them. But by that time, you were going there, like at the Cavern, never went there to try and cop off, you know. I never danced when I was there. Absolutely for the music. And it was true of a lot of lads, I think. You see in pictures, a lot of those, you know, just looking at the stage, you know, it's lads in there, right, who, you know. By the time I was going to the Locarno, I think music was secondary. I think it was girls, you know.
So where did you go to cop off? So it was the Locarno.
Couldn't do it. That was the world's worst, you know. It was terrible. So, you know, that was the major reason for going there.
Country folk music, there's a folk scene, there was an art scene across Liverpool.
There wasn't, of course.
Were you colliding with
that? I 60, we're talking now 60, well, what happened with me was, I got into 64, we're talking about, and I kind of, for me, as I say, it had all become a bit decadent, right? And because I'd had probably Peter, Paul and Mary, right, was my first move into folk music. And what really grabbed me was that lovely finger-picking style of guitar that Paul and Peter Yarrow did. And Mary Travis had a great voice. Yeah. But it was that finger-picking thing. And so I was kind of starting to explore that.
Picked up a guitar again?
I picked up a guitar again. Not with any great seriousness or purpose, but I was walking through Knowsley Village one night, and I'd just been dumped by a girl, and it was my first big heartbreak. And there were some lads sitting on one of the benches. It was kind of autumn time, and it was a decent night. And they had a guitar with them. One of them, Dave Bell, who I'd known from school, Albert Gedman, who knew him from our estate. We weren't great mates, Brian, and we just got talking the way you do, you know. And I said, can I have a go with the guitar? So I had a go with the guitar, and they were well impressed. And I'd never really impressed other players before, but I was better, you know, at that point. And I think I'd done a bit of finger picking, you know, and they were well like, do you want to like join us, you know, join our group? And so, you know, it kind of saved me from this heartbreak in it, you know. And we started going to rehearsals in the Knowsley Cricket Club, the back room there. And after a couple of rehearsals in which we were trying to do rock and roll, and I think somebody's homemade amp blew up and went on fire and all that. And Dave Bell was a smashing singer, and he had a leaning towards folk music. I think we'd had a gab about it. And I said, why don't we just try doing some acoustic, you know? And I think Albert still had a big semi-acoustic Lecky guitar now. But at least you could hear it, because it was a semi. And so we started to do a couple of things like that. And then, very fortuitously, that weekend, they weren't persuaded, but that weekend we went to see the Animals on a big package show at the Empire. And there was also, do you remember the Baron Knight?
I do.
Was it the Baron Knight?
With Duke Dumont.
And
I was chatting to him a few weeks back.
Right. Well, as part of their set, they did, if memory serves, they did Don't Think Twice, It's All Right. And they finger-picked it on a Lecky guitars, you know. And everyone was knocked out by it. And then Eric Burden, the Animals, came on, and he went, we're going to do a tune now we got from Bob Dylan, and it's called The House of the Raising Sun, you know. And it wasn't out on record. Well, you imagine, we were all blown up. And so the conversation going back on the bus was like, that's what I'm on about. Yeah. You know, that's folk music. And so everyone thought, well, let's give it a go, you know. So we started, I think we got the Peter, Paul and Mary album. We did things like Lemon Tree. I got hold of Another Side of Bob Dylan. So we started doing Me Babe. And we see a few kind of down by the riverside and stuff like that. And then shortly after that, we started to get bookings in not in rock clubs, but in working men's clubs. There was a plethora of social clubs then. You know, every factory had its own social club. You know, the Biscuit Factory Social Club, this social club, Warwick Road. And they used to have, on a Sunday, somewhere over in Everton, they used to have a showcase thing. So every young act would go down, you know, boozing away like buggery, you know. And the booking agents for that kind of circuit would line up. And my dad was managing us. And we got, the first time we were there, we got about, because it just coincided with the folk boom, you know. It came above the rate, Trini Lopez doing If I Had a Hammer and stuff like that, you know. And so it was in vogue. And so we got booked, we were called the Movers, we got booked to play these dive kind of social clubs. Usually, again, kind of Sunday lunchtime or Sunday evening as the opening act. So we'd go on with tambourine and, you know, janky guitars and all that kind of stuff and do a 20-minute set, you know, and then, for, I don't know, 20 quid between us or something like that on your way. But it was a good kind of training circuit, you know. Yeah. But we'd go out on the weekend as a group of mates. And we go, again, trying to cop off of that, we go to places like the Peppermint Lounge. And I hated it because, you know, again, I'd been part of the scene when it was at its best. And now it was just, you know, and it was all becoming glitzy and commercialised and Americanised and all that kind of stuff. And one Saturday night, I'll never forget, Dave Bell and I had found out there was a folk club beneath Sampson and Barlow's restaurant on London Road. And we knew it didn't play American folk music. We knew it was a kind of English folk music that we, I think, had tried to introduce into the band, and they'd gone, nah, you know, a bit too hardcore folk. And there was a conversation, me and Dave saying, I'm not going to have Peppermint in Lounge. We want to go to Sampson Barlow's. And I remember, never forget one of the rest of the band saying, well, I'm not going listening to no cow shit music. And that was the end of the band. You know, me and Dave went down to Sampson and Barlow's, walked in, the guy who I ended up with the band, a great guy from Ireland called John Cunning, doing songs. And it was, you know, some of it took a bit of listening, because after his first two songs, he put the guitar down and sang without any accompaniment. I mean, that was such an alien concept if you come from the world that we'd come from. But from then on, I was right into the folk scene then, and we recruited a fabulous guitar player, a younger lad than us called Derek Edwards, and Derek joined myself and Dave, and I was writing lots of parodies and comic songs by then, and somebody put my name down at a Spinners Club. I was there one night, and Gregson as well, and suddenly I was announced as doing a floor spot, and I was cacking it. Solo. And I borrowed Mick Grove's guitar. You know, I'd never held a guitar that cost more than 20 quid before. I had a bloody Gibson in my hand, you know. And I started to sing this comic song about Kirby, and gales of laughter, you know. But I was shaking when we got down.
Do you remember any of the lines?
Yeah, I'm not going to tell you. You know, you get away with it those days, not today, you know. And so next week I was back again with 2 new songs written, and you know, and then I took Dave and Derek down, and we did a couple of floor spots. And then, not long after that, we got approached by Colin Brown, who had a cafe, the only folk cafe that I've ever known of that was outside of London, in Brooks Alley, down near the old post office pub. And it had an acoustic guitar in there, and all the folkies would kind of just use it as their cafe during the day. And you could hang around for hours, have chips and egg, cup of coffee, take the guitar down. First time I walked in, there was a guy playing Angie. I was just blown away. Mike, I forget his second name. I've never heard Angie before, you know, it was just incredible. And we'd started to have a bit of success. The Spinners had asked us to make a guest appearance on one of their shows at the Philharmonic. You know, 2,000 people. Big gig, yeah. And we got a gig Christian Aid Week playing the Cathedral, you know, 2000s, you know. So we're making, and Colin asked us if we'd run a club in the Green Moose. So the 3 of us started this club on a Thursday night, 2 quid between us. So it was, you know, 10 bob each and 10 bob for the petrol.
Was it humour? I mean, what
humorous songs and
okay.
traditional songs by then, a mix.
Okay.
And my very wordy kind of social comment songs. I played in my backyard yesterday, and bottle of gin on the table, wrist slashing. Before Morrissey was even, a glimmer in his parents' eyes, I was writing real wrist slashing dirges with all the zeal of youth, trying to change the world and all that kind of stuff. Along with, as I say, comic songs, love songs, and things like that. And it was a great, the Moose was a great scene. It was terrific, and we started, because there were. At that time, in the Merseyside area, if I had somebody like Barbara Dixon, I'd invite Barbara down, and Barbara could do a Merseyside tour, from our house, because there were so many folk clubs around the place, and so we were out playing every night of the week, either a paid gig, or we'd go to a floor spot, or we'd go to sessions and that kind of thing. We did that up until about 69, 69, 70, that period.
So you already knew Barbara?
I knew Barbara because she was hitching from London to Edinburgh with a great friend of mine called Titch Freer, who had been in a partnership with Davy Johnson, who's now Elton John's guitarist and MD. And they got stranded, and Titch realised that we didn't live too far from the East Lancs. So he decided to call in, at least, get cleaned up, have a meal before they went back on the road hitching again. And they got them, and my mum fed them, and she said, our Billy, because I was not even Willy then to my parents, our Billy's in town at one of those folk club places, and he's getting married in the morning, the night before I got married. And I'd gone along to folk club. And then Titch appeared, who I knew, and introduced me to Barbara, and I didn't know from Adam, and she did a floor spot, and she killed the place, it was just, what a voice. And so I got to know her through that, and then I'd written a very early play, and I'd used it. She recorded very early, Barbara, and I needed a track for this play. And there was a song of Archie Fisher's called The Climb that she'd recorded, and we used it in the show, and then took it to Edinburgh. This is about 72 by now, and Barbara had come along to see the show, and we
What was the name?
We kept up with each other. It was called Keep Your Eyes Down. It was part of a triple bill called Blind Scouts. I had 3 players, a lunchtime play and then a double bill in the evening. And because of that Scottish connection, I had lots of kind of mates in the kind of folky world.
Right.
So I tended to operate between Merseyside and Edinburgh.
And then out of that, you started looking back, John, Paul, George, Ringo and Bert. You realised there was a tale.
The last time I had anything to do with Barbara doing work in the Merseyside area, I was in the middle of writing John, Paul, George, Ringo and Bert.
How did that come about? And what was
How did what come about?
John, Paul, George, Ringo and Bert. I mean, what was the inspiration, if you like?
I'd written a couple of pieces.
That's early. That's early, isn't it? Really, to be looking back. Early 70s.
It's early 70s. Yeah. I'd done this show in Edinburgh that included the track of Barbara's. While I was in Edinburgh, John McGrath, the playwright who'd helped really carve out what the Everyman was going to be with the director Alan Dosser, fabulous playwright John, and very much kind of in awe of him. But he came in to see our lunchtime show, which was a spoof of Tam O'Shanter, Sam O'Shanter, 50 minutes, reset, modernised, set in Liverpool. The horse now has changed to My Old Van and stuff like that. I mean, really broad comedy. I was the narrator in it. And John was so knocked out by it. Alan Dosser was coming up to Edinburgh the weekend of our last performance, and John said to Dosser, "You've got to go see the work of this Liverpudlian lad." And Dosser was on a promise with some woman who didn't want to see the show. And he had to have his arm really badly twisted, and he came to see the show. And I met him afterwards in the pub, and he said, "When you get back to Liverpool, come to the theatre and see me." I'd already submitted stuff to the Everyman and had it kind of overlooked. But I got down there, and he said to me, "Will you adapt an Alan Plater play that's set in Hull? We need it resetting in Liverpool." So I did my first professional job for the Everyman in 73. It was an adaptation. And then the Everyman had this guerrilla organisation called Van Load, and it was 5 actors in a van, and they'd take a specially written hour piece out into non-theatre environments, right? The idea was to take theatre. Certain people would not come into the theatre, right? So the idea was to take the theatre out to them in some of the hardest, most hardened drinking dens, clubs and pubs of Merseyside, and just do a show. The idea being that you'd light the spark of culture and these people would then come into the theatre. I mean, it was so well intentioned, but so off its head when you think about it, Some of these people, looking at this play going on, what's that racket over there? When's it going to stop? I mean, people like, Anthony Sher doing this, Peter Bostlesway, Julie Walters, And, I mean, people think of them as lovies, they didn't know how to go through it to get where they got to, And I'd written a musical version now of Tam O'Shanter, Sam O'Shanter for Van Load. And the second night it played, it was in Everton. And Alan Dosser said to me, Manchester have done a show about the Beatles. He said, I want to go over and see it. And I want to take you with me. I said, oh. And Alan knew nothing about popular music. I knew that, I said, why? He said, well, I've been told Manchester shouldn't be doing it. We should be doing a show. I said, oh, I'll come over. So I went over, saw this show, and I could see immediately, I mean, all the dialogue in it had been culled from existing biographies.
Right.
So it just didn't work well enough, and it slavishly followed a chronology. But what was extraordinary was, it was the first time I saw Bernard Hill, because Bernard played John Lennon in there. And so on the way back, Alan Dosser, the director, said to me, all right, would you adapt that for us? And this, fledgling teacher by now, part-time playwright, has the arrogance that any young writer needs, I'm sorry to say, no, I'll write you a piece myself. And I said, what you don't realise is that I'm completely steeped in where that play comes from, I mean, it's in my DNA, and I started to tell him about some of this stuff, and by the time we got back to Liverpool, he was obviously convinced. I didn't know at the time, that this was a massive call for, he had to go to the board, because it was the most expensive show that they'd ever done. And very quickly, there was a band around at the time called Sticky George. Remember Sticky George? There was slightly art house. Right. A band, came out of that. And Alan said, so, I know the actors I want to play the Beatles. Jonathan Pryce was going to play Lennon at that point. Anthony Sher, Philip Joseph, Trevor Eve, George Costigan was going to play Bert. And he said, and we'll bring in Sticky George to do the music Beatles. And I just knew this was such folly. Because I was going to write in tracks like Lucy in the Sky, tracks that the Beatles themselves had never played live. They'd been conceived in a recording studio. There wasn't the equipment in the early 1970s, to convincingly play those tracks. It just didn't exist. And so I knew it was going to be a disaster. I didn't say anything at the time, because everyone was really fond of Sticky George. They're a great band in that, but, and at the same time, Barbara was staying with me, and I was saying I'm working on this show about the Beatles, but once I finished it, I've got to write something that we can use your voice in, Barbara. It would be fantastic if I could write something based upon a traditional ballad, Little Musgrave or Sir Patrick Spens, or one of the great epic child ballads. That's what, because Barbara came from the folk scene, I was only thinking of her in folk terms. And as part of that tour, I had to go and pick her up from a folk club in Rainford. And when I got there, they were having a little bit of a stay back. And there was a piano there. And at some point, Barbara sat down at this piano. Someone was playing guitar. And she started thumping out chords to Stuck in the Middle with You. I didn't know she could play a piano. And it was a revelation, Wow, what a sound that is. Barbara came back to our house, stayed over, finished the tour, went home, The following Sunday, I thought, this, John Paul Jones, this is, because I'd now seen her play the piano. Yeah. And what I wouldn't have done is have a folky Beatles kind of player. That wouldn't have done at all. But piano is, as we know, an entire orchestra. So I called her up. She was terrified. No, I couldn't. No, absolutely no. Now, very unusually in the folk scene, Barbara was being managed at that time. Bernard, I forgot Bernard's second name, and ruthlessly managed. He put her fee up from £15 to £19 when I booked her into my college, so he wasn't the most popular guy in the block. But I knew he had sway, and I called him up and I said, I'm trying to persuade Barbara. He said, leave it to me, because he knew the main chance, and he could he could immediately see that this could completely change things, you know. And so 2 days later, I got a call back saying, Barbara, can I do it? And so we brought Barbara down. She had to audition. Well, first of all, I had to persuade Alan Dosser and Chris Bond, who was associate director, that, against their better judgment, you know, that it should be this woman. And they were very. I remember I had to go over to their house. They both lived in the same house in Sefton Park, and I took Barbara's record with me. I played them a track called Winter, staggering. And it started off with, well, let's listen to this, you know, and they both grudgingly said, all right, well, we'll see her, you know. And she came down to the theatre. All the company were out on tour, and there wasn't even a piano, there was a harmonium. And she sat on stage playing this harmonium. As she was in the middle of, I think it was Here Comes the Sun, on harmonium, the company that had been on tour came into the auditorium, and every one of them just stopped in the tracks, just lowered themselves into a seat. And she didn't know she had an audience behind her, you know. It just, wow, kicked off. But then, even then, you know, I think the wage in the company then was about £48 a week. And Bernard negotiated a fee of £54 a week for Barbara, who was taking a real hit. You know, she could play 7 folk clubs, 19 quid, do the sums, you know. I won't say who, one of the company actually, you got a strike together, you know, because it was breaking parity and somebody was getting more than them. So, and it almost nearly fell apart because of that. But fortunately, good sense prevailed, and Barbara opened in it. And, you know, the world was never the same again for any of it.
One thing you haven't mentioned there, I mean, I'm assuming Apple must have been aware of what you were doing.
No, we didn't tell anyone. No, we didn't.
Is that the trick?
We didn't apply for rights to anything. Well, I didn't.
Because that could have been a problem.
Massive
so
problem.
Avoid the problem.
Every man just completely avoided the problem. As soon as we opened, I remember being locked in the bistro, you know, and there were, you know, threatening letters being pushed through.
Right.
And what happened, of course, was as soon as the show opened and it became known in London, producers swooped down. I was approaching them. Is your name Willy Russell? Yeah. In my pocket, I have £2,000 in cash, which I will hand over to you now for the rights of. I mean, it was a sleaze. I'd been around the block on the folk scene, so I knew you didn't. Even though I'd yet to meet my new agent, Peggy Ramsey. I knew that he didn't behave like that. And I said to Alan Dosser, I said to this guy, excuse me a second, I said, this guy, he threw him out, literally threw him out, you know. And then...
you still have the rights.
Still completely have the rights. But we didn't have the rights to the music. And the one producer amongst all these producers who worked it out was Robert Stigwood, right? So Robert, without even coming to Liverpool, right, is head of theatre, Bob Swash, who then became my producer. Lovely, lovely man, and not at all like these rather second-hand car salesman producers. A lovely man. Bob had seen the show and loved the show. So on Bob's recommendation, the show, Robert Stigwood went straight to ATV. ATV then controlled the music. Lou Grade, right? And Robert did a deal to secure the tracks that were in the show. So he then came up to see the show with my agent. I was meeting her for the first time, who'd also brought in the great play producer Michael Codron, because Peggy didn't trust Stigwood on his own because he had a bit of a reputation, you know. In fact, in retrospect, it would have been much better if it had not been a co-production between Stigwood and Michael Codron. I think everybody would have been better in soul, because we got lost between the two, old school and Robert a bit rapacious, a bit kind of rock and roll, And, but because he now had the music rights stitched up, it was never spelled out, we're making you an offer you can't refuse, but there was an element of that. And so what happened was the division became, as it would be, I was the writer of the book and of the two pastiche songs of mine, and John Lennon and Paul McCartney were composer lyricists. So my royalty then was split 50-50, 50 for me, writer of the book, and 50% went to ATV. And that's how the deal was done.
Did they ever come to see it, any of the Beatles?
The last matinee, George Harrison went to see it at the Lyric Inn, and had a dreadful time because the audience knew he was in and spent most of the time. Now, he left at the interval, and he very gracefully said that the reason he left was by the time it got to the interval, there were more people turning around staring at him than the poor actors on stage. But I did read somewhere along the line that he hated it, and I've got no, problem with that at all. I'd hate it if I saw myself portrayed in that way, It would be, I see myself if somebody writes a feature piece on me in a newspaper, and I just don't recognise myself. It's like I've been dissembled and reassembled with everything that's just slightly out, So I'd never had any problem with that. The only problem I ever had was Paul badmouthed it, and Paul badmouthed it on the basis of it had been done on the forerunner of the South Bank show program called Full House, and I'd said to whoever was filming it, don't go in close because Tony has got 3 hours makeup job to do, the prosthetic nose and all that, and which is fine in a theatre, you're not up close, but cameras will reveal that. And again, the musically, the back line, they just didn't, record it, and it looked and sounded a mess. And it included a scene, taken out of context, in which it appears that Paul is breaking up the group. Well, I knew my Beatle history. I knew that John Lennon had left the group before anybody had, and all that kind of stuff, But Paul took exception to that, and he kicked off in an interview, and he said, da-da-da-da-da, written by this little fella from Liverpool, a little fella, So I thought, okay. And of course, to me, they were tall, they were gods, because you used to see them, And years later, when I had I'd written a film called Band on the Run, and it had not got made because, again, Beatles had taken objection to it, and they could stop the release of this putative film in America. They couldn't in Britain.
Was this connected to Band on the Run? Paul's?
I took this was prior to my writing Band on the Run. Actually, this is how that came about. What had I done? I was doing I know what it was. I was doing Breezebot Park in London, follow-up play to John Paul Jones and Albert, and I'd done an interview for the Sunday Times about Breezebot Park, right? And I know what it was. I'd written a screenplay of John Paul, George, Ringo and Bert, and that's what they stopped because they said you'll never release it. And of course they had no truck with Stigwood, because Stigwood had famously said to them, "You're next on my shopping list or something."
I'll get you. Nems or something.
Yeah. And they really took against him. So this film was in pre-production when the plug was completely pulled. Again, I completely understood. I had no problem with that. And for the first time during this Breezebot Park interview, I told that story, not in a whinging way at all. Paul read it. Okay, I was staying at a house in Barnes. I was down with the flu. I had to be out my bed from the house next door. Not everyone had a phone in those days. There's a phone call for Willy. Willy come and say, I thought my show was in trouble, so it's to do with rehearsals and that. I better get out. Oh, hi, it's Paul. Paul McCartney. Put the phone down. Classic thing. Go back to bed. Some kid comes around. He's on the phone again. Listen, it's Paul. You know what you said about me in the paper? I went, oh, hold on, I didn't say, I said, I think you've got the wrong end of the stick anyway, Paul, because I didn't, it wasn't. So I said, have you ever read the script? Anyway, he invites me round to St John's Wood, to the house, And I get over the flu, I go to the house, walk up the steps to the door opens, and I'm like that, waiting for this really tall guy to come out after me. And he was in his stocking feet as well. From Liverpool. Well, he's certainly not my height, so I didn't mention the little fella from Liverpool. I think the point's been made, hasn't it? So and we had a lovely time, and I got to know Linda for the first time, and I loved. And we kind of made contact, and then later on, I got a call from Brian Brolly, who was head of MPL at that time, asking me to go meet with Paul about. Paul wanted to do a movie with Wings, wanted a movie writing, and the result of that was that I went up to Scotland, spent a week at the farm. Paul was. Had the Rack studio up there and was working on an album, Wings' last album, called Back to the Egg, which I have to say, it's been battered a bit since that album, but if you'd been there listening to some of those mixes before it got, I think, over-mixed, I think it was just a bit over-egged, unfortunate pun. But it had some fantastic stuff on it. And I when I was there, I floated various ideas for movies, and then I'd remembered, of course, when Wings had started off, doing that hit and run thing. Just turn up in a university town, do the gig that night at 50p, and I understood that the liberation that Paul sought. He wanted to get away from the massive Beatle thing on his back and go back to being, a simple. I mean, you can't do it when you're Paul and you're carrying all that with you, But I really admired the fact that he was trying to do that, and so I thought, there's a movie in this, and so what I did was I wrote about a figure of Paul's stature, a solo singer, a kind of Sinatra-esque, playing the Royal Festival Hall, a guy called Jet, right, and that's Paul. And at the same time that he's playing the Albert Hall with his big band and all that kind of stuff, he goes off for a costume change mid-number, and at the same time you see this really punk, hard little band playing in a pub where a fight breaks out. And the meanest one in this band is the woman, Linda, who smacks this guy in the mouth, the whole thing kicks off and and they have to get out of this place, they have to get into the van and get down the motorway. And you cut back to the Royal Albert Hall, and all the quick change dresses are there and he just keeps walking, and he just walks, and the band's still playing, and he just keeps walking. And you see him just getting to the roller. And of course, the next thing is you're in a service cafe, and there's this band, licking their wounds, having not been paid this gig and all that, and they look across and they see him, and he gets to the till, right, with his cup of coffee, and of course, he's not got a penny on him. And he goes to the girl, sorry about this, you know who I am? She goes, I haven't got a clue, mate. I haven't got a clue. I have to pay for your coffee. And of course, Denny Lane goes over and says, you're all right, mate, here, and pays for his coffee. So he ends up joining them, and that's the move, the kick-off for the movie. Which, we had a reading of it, me, Paul, and Mike Ockran, who wrote it, but now dragged Mike in because he didn't want to do it on my own, to be honest. And
why?
Because I knew the world of rock and roll and the world of film is so alien to what I did. I'm a writer, right, and writing in that way. And so I knew there would be moments when I'd want someone to talk to about it who was there, because I was going to go through some difficult, film's difficult for a writer anyway. Rock and roll, all the shots were being called by, so I was already having to cope with things like, if we have a white horse in that, and I go, the white horse ain't going to happen, so I wanted somebody on my side, I'm afraid. Moments like that. Sorry, I don't know where I was going before that. Anyway, yeah. So the film was written. We had a couple of readings of it. Paul was carrying on mixing. He'd moved down to the south now. Was working in a castle on the album, doing the videos for the album. We had another couple of meetings about the movie. It was all going well. Then Paul is on tour. I kind of forgotten the project really when I get a call from Paul at home one morning saying, "Where are you?" So I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You know, we're at the press conference at the Royal Court." He said, "I'm going to announce the movie." I said, "So?" He said, "Bang on the run." He said, "I'm going to announce it." I said, when are you going to film it?" He said, "When we get back from Japan." I said, "Hold on. You've got at least a year's pre-production before this movie." "No, don't be a suit. Come on, you know." I said, It's not magical mystery tour, Paul." No. I'm thinking, this is. So I go down to the press conference, you know, and was it mentioned? I don't think it was mentioned, actually. I don't know why, but it wasn't mentioned. And so I went to the gig that night. It was a smashing. Remember, I got a ticket for Carol Ann Duffy. Carol Ann was with Adrian still at the time, and Adrian was there as well. And I got on with the rest of my life. Paul did the tour. Paul went to Japan. He got to customs. They opened the bag and they found some. And whilst he had a couple of weeks in the nick there, he decided he'd taken the Wings project as far, which I thought was a very good decision, because one of the difficulties for us had been, of course, was writing parts for these. Basically, Lawrence and Steve, fantastic players, but they were session players. You know what I mean? They didn't have any identifiable character that you could write, so they were fairly thin written parts. Denny was great, you know, and the role for Linda. But I'm beginning to weary with the sound of my own bass too. And this ain't going to make the cut, because you must have more material than
superb. This is fascinating to hear. So it didn't happen. And indeed, John Paul...
No, it didn't happen, no.
John Paul, George, Ringo and Per hasn't happened for a long time, has it?
No, it hasn't.
Is there a reason for that?
But this is going to be the last one, right? Because I'm going to...
Yeah, no, don't worry. Yes, no, absolutely.
What happened with John Paul, George, Ringo and Bert was we had the agreement, of course, with ATV that I mentioned earlier, and so it was perfectly possible to produce it. Although we had to, just as a footnote, we'd had to take out, that was as a result of George coming to see it, we had to take out. There was a lovely moment where I inserted, when the Beatles are at their absolute low.
I know where it's going to be, because this sent chills through my spine.
In the Bleak Midwinter.
In the Bleak Midwinter.
Which segues into Here Comes the Sun. And George pulled it because, of course, it wasn't covered by the Northern Songs Agreement by ATV. It was his own publishing, and so we had to replace it with Good Day Sunshine, with great track, but not the same. But as long as it was an ATV controlled song, we were okay. And thereafter, there were a few productions because it was licensable. But shortly after that, ATV sold it on to Michael Jackson. And people would apply to do it and would not be able to get clearance for the music. Now, I have no idea, I never inquired as to why that was, but I've always wondered if there was, a specific agreement that they wouldn't, because it was never, even when Michael Jackson had it, nothing was ever licensed for advertising, commercials, which is kind of unusual in that, thank goodness it didn't and it wasn't. So maybe some would, and then of course, it all ended up in hock to, was it Pepsi or Coke?
Nike got one of the songs, I think.
Yeah, and one of the big record companies, or publishing companies, and I don't know where the stuff is now. I mean, trying to trace them, that's gone into that copyright the merry-go-round is a nightmare.
I know that was the last one, but any pull to do the story of the Mersey Sound, where you're not tied into songs, copyright and so on. Any pull back to your youth to actually create the story of the Mersey Sound outside of the Beatles?
No. Just no, because I've done John Paul Jones, but I don't want to go back. My take on it.
But we can't see it, can we?
And there have been Cavern of Dreams that Spencer Lee had a massive hand in. Carol Ann wrote the script when she was still, she still played. I just had a show on the National. I think there's a show to be written. Yeah. I still think there's a show to be written. There was that TV series that did a fictionalised version of it a few years, about 10, 12 years ago. I can't remember the name of it, but it didn't really get there. More interestingly, what I've tried to find a way into and never been able to is I've always wanted to set something. I'd love to do it at telly, but having an idea doesn't mean to say that it will ever happen. But I've always thought it would be terrific if there was a piece of ongoing drama set in that Liverpool world of the arts and writing, when the poets were around, because it touched the music, and it touched theatre, and it touched, that kind of Liverpool. I don't want to say. It's not literary Liverpool, it's not arty Liverpool, it's not rock and roll, but it's all those things, And if you could find the right, it would have to be, I think, a fiction. If you came up with the right fiction that then set itself in that reality, I think it could be terrific. If you're a slave to actuality, it usually ends up as kind of documentary-ish and rather thin.
Yeah. And to play you out one song from the period, what would it be?
It would have to be, but it was never recorded. It would have to be the Beatles version of some other guy.
Excellent. Willy Russell, absolute joy.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.